Sign up for a year and pay less than 71 pesos per month. Visit tmt.ph/digital to get your free 30 days of the Manila Times Digital Edition.
Kalasan silanganan, alam ng puso, sa dibdib mo'y buhay. Lupang inirang, duyan ka ng magiting, sa manlulutig, di ka pasisiil. Sa dagat at bundok, sa simoy at sa langit mong bukaw, may dalagang tula at awit sa paglayang inamahal. Ang kislap ng watawat mo'y tagumpay na nagniningning. Ang bituin at araw niya kailan pa may di magdidilim. Lupa ng araw ng walhating ng sinta, buhay langit sa piling ko. Aming ligaya na pag may mga atin na pumatay ng dahil sa'yo.
Good morning. I am Dante Klingang, Chairman and CEO of the Manila Times. Welcome to today's Campus Press Forum. Let me just say that the Manila Times has always been, well, since 2000, a teaching newspaper, which is why we've endeavored to add the section Campus Press. The Campus Press is a weekly section in our newspaper where we hope to feature stories and other content written by aspiring or student journalists across the Philippines. And we have many of you here today. So for those attending this forum, maybe you'd like to put in the chat box what schools you represent. And I hope that you will find today's session very productive. We didn't plan it this way, but it seems appropriate that we have two excellent women journalists as our first guest. Of course, Allison Jackson from Agence France Presse, and Ms. Marga Ortigas, formerly from CNN, Al Jazeera, and others, and recently a book author. Thank you for sharing your time today. I know you guys are very busy, and Allison, I believe, is on the campaign trail following the latest developments. Before we start, let me just say thank you to our partners who made this event possible. SM Foundation and Talk Shop are our co-presenters. Our special partners are BDO Unibank, Converge, and Grad Philippines. I'd like to thank also our organizational partners, the British Chamber of Commerce in the Philippines, the Cebu Chamber of Commerce, the French Chamber of Commerce, the Davao Chamber of Commerce, the Financial Executives Institute of the Philippines, the Italian Chamber of Commerce of the Philippines, the Management Association of the Philippines, our newest chamber partner, the Nordic Chamber of Commerce in the Philippines Incorporated, and also the Philippine Center for Islam and Democracy, who hosts the program She Talks Peace. Of course, our media partner is the Manila Times TV. Let me just make a couple of announcements. Part of our initiatives to help promote journalism in the Philippines, as I said, is Campus Press, but we are expanding that this year to include also a microsite where we can feature links to the stories that you feature in your newspaper websites and social media platforms. So for those schools who would like to partner with us, or maybe would like to have a national platform for your content, please let us know, and we will be glad to partner with you. Also, as I said, this is the first Campus Press event of the Manila Times. Our next event will be in late May 25, I believe, after the elections, when we will feature speakers who will talk about libel, copyright, and related topics. So with that, let me start and introduce our first speaker this morning. As I said, she is joining us from Ilocos Norte, where she's covering the launch of the local government campaigns. She is, of course, Ms. Allison Jackson, who has been a journalist for 25 years, working for newspapers, news agencies as a freelancer, and other roles. She began her career in Australia and since then has worked in China, Mexico, Afghanistan, Brazil, Bolivia, and of course the Philippines. She speaks several languages, but she's being modest when she says she speaks them badly, but she does dabble in Spanish, Portuguese, and Chinese. She is currently based in Manila, where she is the bureau chief of the wire service Agence France Presse. Good morning, Allison, and the screen is yours.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. It's a huge honour to be with you this morning. As Dante mentioned, I'm currently in Ilocos Norte covering the launch of the local election campaigns. Obviously, being in Ilocos Norte, that would mean the Marcos campaigns, Team Marcos. It's wonderful to see that so many people are interested in pursuing a career in journalism. I've certainly found it to be a very rewarding profession. And I think in this era of rampant misinformation and fake news that's spreading on social media, the work of journalists who are committed to reporting the facts has never been more important. So I applaud you that you are wanting to embark on this career path. So today I'm going to share with you just my journey in journalism, which has been, I'd say, a never-ending adventure, and one that I really could never have imagined when I started out 25 years ago. Just even saying 25 years seems, I sort of pinched myself because it doesn't really feel that long, but there you go. I started in Sydney in Australia. I'm Australian. And as Dante mentioned, since then I've been very lucky to work in several countries around the world, in Asia and Latin America. So yeah, my first country was in China, and then I moved on to Mexico, Afghanistan, Brazil, Bolivia, and now here in the Philippines. I'm currently the bureau chief for the international news agency Agence France-Presse, and I just want to pause there to explain quickly what a news agency is, because I think a lot of people don't fully understand what that means. A news agency is like a wholesaler of news. So AFP, we provide text, stories, videos, photos, graphics, and in more recent years, a fact-check service to other media outlets around the world who subscribe to our service, including the Manila Times, a very valued client of ours here in the Philippines. So I guess I'll just start at the beginning. So I decided to pursue a career in journalism when I was in high school, like many of you, I think, are in high school at the moment. And I did a couple of weeks work experience on a local newspaper in a country town in Australia, and I absolutely loved it. I think I just really enjoyed the news gathering process, and then seeing the finished product the next day in the newspaper. I was completely hooked. So I went off to journalism school, and then got my first job in a weekly newspaper in the western suburbs of Sydney. And to this day, and I was 19 at that time. So to this day, it's still one of the best jobs I've ever had. And I've been a foreign correspondent for I think 13 years, but that first job I had was it was still very dear to me, that experience. I was the sports reporter, the police reporter, and the court reporter. And just remember, I was 19. I mean, I knew nothing. And these were sort of, beats that I would never have had the opportunity to cover had I started my career on a big newspaper, like this, in Australia. So this was like a massive opportunity for me. And fortunately, I had a very good editor and wonderful senior colleagues who really helped show me the ropes of journalism. And I just want to pause there to say, like 25 years later, I'm still learning. I'm still trying to perfect the craft of journalism, still trying to improve my interviewing skills, still trying to be a better writer. I think it's one of those careers that you just never stop learning and trying to improve, which I think is one of the things I really like about it. And also trying to adapt to the way journalism has changed over those more than 2 decades. When I started journalism, it was the beginning of the internet, which I know for all of you that must sound like the dark ages or medieval times. But when I started, there were no smartphones, there was no social media, there weren't even online publications. So the pace of news was much slower. And just as an example, when I would go out into the field to report and I would have to file my story, I would handwrite my story in my notebook, and then I would ring a person called a copy taker and dictate my story over the phone to that person, who would then send the story to the editors. And obviously nowadays that would, you just file it from wherever you were, because you would have internet, you'd have your laptop, you would have a smartphone. So things have really changed since I started. And also another example is as well, like in those days, there were like physical libraries. We didn't have Google to go and just look up how to spell somebody's name or fact check something. We had to actually go down to a physical library in the newspaper and look at hard copy, the actual books and old files that we had. So, things have really, it's been like a revolution in journalism. So after the local newspaper, I joined the Sydney Morning Herald in Sydney, and I worked there for quite a few years. First as a court reporter covering murder trials and civil lawsuits and the like, and was then dragged kicking and screaming into the business section of the newspaper. And I just want to talk about a little bit about this experience, because I think this is a really, for me, it had a huge impact on the trajectory of my career. I didn't know it at the time. I was resentful of my editor's decision to send me to the business section. I had absolutely no interest in the stock market or company news. But my editors were much wiser than me and realised that as a young journalist, I was in my early 20s, that this was really important to my formation as a journalist and to sort of round out my skills. And honestly, they were absolutely right. I think it's so important that you understand this stuff, like finance reporting. If you can get your head around that, it will pay off many times, over the course of your career, because inevitably, even if you have no interest in being a business reporter, at some point there will be some sort of financial angle to a story. And if you can get to grips with that really quickly, then it will really set you apart. It also helps you get jobs in journalism, frankly. It opened many doors for me that would have otherwise been shut, because let's face it, journalists mostly shy away from numbers. We're much more comfortable with words. But for me, once I had that finance reporting experience on my CV, I was able to move on to other positions, and it was one of the two factors that led me directly to working for AFP and beginning my and becoming a foreign correspondent. The other thing that really helped me, was critical in my career in becoming a foreign correspondent, was learning another language. I had studied French in high school, but in country Queensland in Australia, there's not a lot of opportunity to speak French, so my French didn't really progress very far. But in my early 20s, I discovered during my travels, like backpacking in Asia, I fell in love with China and the Chinese language. So 2009, AFP offered me a job as the economics correspondent in Beijing. So those two things that which at the time I had no idea. When I started studying Chinese, I was just studying it because I loved Chinese. I did finance very reluctantly, but eventually those two things sort of intersected to then launch my career with AFP. So I spent a few years in China covering, the fast-growing Chinese economy and, trying to tell that story in a way that would be sort of interesting to a general audience. We're not writing for investment bankers. We're writing for people like my mother, just a regular person who has very limited knowledge about China. So, that would mean, if I was doing a story about inflation, I would go down to the local food market and talk to, grannies who are buying garlic and green vegetables for their families about the prices and how that was affecting their families. And I think it's just always really important, and this is something that I always try to do, and that I know AFP tries to do, is we put people at the front and centre of our reporting. It's because whatever the issue is, whether that's climate change or the pandemic, I think it's really important that we show how this affects regular people. After a few years in China, I took a break from AFP and moved to Mexico to freelance. I didn't speak a word of Spanish, so I had to learn the language in order to operate independently as a journalist. And this was my first foray into visual storytelling. My partner there was a videographer, and we would do mini documentaries for another news agency. And my job was to be the producer and the scriptwriter. And I think this was like a really valuable experience for me in my career, because it really taught me how to think more visually and really helped my storytelling and my ability as a writer to make my stories much more vivid and lively. And, we covered everything from, a bullfighting school to a horseback pilgrimage in the mountains. And it was a really, really wonderful adventure. But at some point I decided that I wanted to rejoin AFP. And fortunately for me, they took me back. So in 2016, I moved back to Hong Kong that's our regional headquarters for the Asia Pacific. And a few months later, they offered me the job of bureau chief in Kabul in Afghanistan. So this was undoubtedly the most challenging position of my career to that point. At that point, I had never worked in a Muslim country or covered a war. Mexico had been a dangerous place to live and work, but Afghanistan was sort of on a different level. Kidnapping was a constant threat, and bombings in Kabul were frequent. And my time in Afghanistan overlapped with probably one of the most violent stages of the war, which, at that point had been going on for nearly 2 decades. So as bureau chief, I was responsible for the entire operation there. So from the stories we produced to security, to keeping the staff safe. And we took, a lot of precautions, but, at the end of the day, we were there to report the news. So it meant we would go out regularly to do interviews in around Kabul, to also and around the country. But this was this war was. I guess the war dominated our coverage. It was inevitable, but this was also a country that was functioning as a society despite the war. So there were, people were going to work, people were getting married, couples, young people were hanging out in cafes, parents were dropping their kids off at school. And so in a place like Afghanistan, the ordinary becomes the extraordinary and becomes interesting as a story. So we really worked hard to try to tell those stories. And I think one of the most memorable stories for me personally was about a female running group. So I'm a passionate runner. I've always been a long distance runner. So I was fascinated to learn that there was a group of young women who were really pushing the boundaries of this extremely conservative society to go running in public. So we spent a few weeks following this group of girls around Kabul on their morning runs, and in parts of the city that were sort of considered relatively safe. And one day we went with them into the mountains that encircled Kabul, and it was, I'd been gazing longingly at these mountains for months and hadn't been able to go there for security reasons, because as a foreigner it was considered a bit too dangerous. But yes, we went with this group. We hiked and ran for hours in the mountains, and it was a very sort of moving experience, because I remember for these girls, this was sort of like the highlight of their week, and spending time with them, because we really invested a lot of time in this story. You sort of get to know the subjects of your story quite reasonably well, and you can go a bit deeper in your conversations if you have the time. And I remember one of these girls describing to me how running made her feel. It was like she felt free as a bird, and I was so moved by that. It was an activity that was very important in my life, but something that I'd really taken for granted, was like a precious gift for these women. So yeah, we did a text story and video and photo, and it was a very moving story. But yeah, of course, it was a very dangerous country to be in, and I did have one particularly close call. I was in a hotel covering a press conference, and a few hours later, the Taliban, whose fighters had been hiding in the hotel at that point when I had been there, they launched an attack on the guests in the hotel, and they were targeting foreigners, and they killed dozens. So it's just a real reminder that sometimes luck is like the only thing that stands between a person and death in a place like Afghanistan. It was a real reality check for me, I suppose, at that point. After Afghanistan, I was sent to Brazil, which probably the other end of the spectrum in terms of way a society functions, I suppose. I went from a country where I had to cover up completely, and as a woman, I was not, you're sort of, well, women are generally oppressed and sort of treated as second-class citizens, to then going to a country where people are hanging out at the beach and frankly not wearing very much. So it was quite a bit of a whiplash for me. Anyway, but then I eventually came back to Asia and got this position in the Philippines. And I don't know how I'm going for time. Dante, am I going over?
No, it's fascinating. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I'm trying to sort of whip through this, but I don't really want to take up too much of your time. So I arrived.
No, it's interesting.
Okay. So I arrived in Manila in October of 2020, so right in the middle of the pandemic. And it's been really challenging for us in the media, I think, to try to operate, try to cover the news, but also to try and stay safe and well. Most of my colleagues when I arrived were still working remotely, and it wasn't until the middle of last year that we were fully vaccinated. So, but before that, we had to cover the news. I'm sure you all remember, the devastating impact the pandemic lockdowns had on people, on the economy. Jeepney drivers with no work, the level of hunger that sort of reached record levels. And so we were trying to do those stories, going out to interview people, spending significant amounts of time with people in close contact, to try and tell those stories, which we felt were really important, because I guess as journalists, it's our job, it's our duty to bear witness. And it's important for us to tell those stories so that the rest of the world knows what was going on here, because I think the Philippines was definitely one of the countries hardest hit by the pandemic, and the economic impact here has been devastating for so many people. But how do you do that and not get sick yourself? Because at one point, hospitals here, as I'm sure you all remember, were overflowing. People were lining up for hours to try and get a bed, and that was particularly concerning for me as the bureau chief, because my job is to try to keep my own staff, my own colleagues safe. So I was very worried about any of us getting sick, because I was like, well, what are we going to do if everyone else can't get into a hospital? We won't be able to either. So that was a very stressful time, I think, for everybody. And but I guess our belief in what we were doing is what you keep going, because you feel this, it's important, it's our job, this is what we do. So I guess, I don't, I'm not quite sure how much more time I've got left, but I just wanted to sort of start ending my presentation here by just, saying to you, journalism is a fantastic profession, but these are challenging times, really challenging times for the industry. And I guess, and as we've seen in this election campaign, we're seeing with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the huge volume of misinformation and fake news that is out there. And this is extremely challenging for us as journalists to navigate. So I think it's one of those moments where it's so important for us as journalists to really adhere to the basics of journalism, balanced, factual, transparent reporting, and to not simply accept what we see or hear, but to try to verify. I think we're all familiar with just how clever this misinformation, disinformation can be, and how deceptive it can be, how sophisticated it is. So, and we've seen how influential it is. We're seeing that here in the Philippines, particularly, just how effective it is at rewriting history in many people's minds. So I think as journalists, we have a really important role to try to counter that misinformation, disinformation, and present news that is trustworthy, and that people can, it's our obligation to do that. I think as journalists, we have to, always be curious. I think that's one of the most important things, I think, for a journalist, and to talk to people, but lots of people, and not just people in your family or your friends, but people you would not normally want to talk to, perhaps, who don't share your beliefs or your values or your opinions. Because I think what we have seen in the past, in recent years in journalism is, I guess the election of Donald Trump was one classic example where it really caught people by surprise. But actually, it's just, those people just didn't suddenly, they were there all the time, the Trump supporters. It's just, I think one of the problems was journalists weren't talking to them because they weren't in the same sort of social networks. And I think as journalists, we have an obligation to try to, you cast the net wide, you talk to a lot of people, you try to understand what regular people are thinking. And it doesn't mean just talking to analysts, like this analyst or that analyst. It means talking to regular people. What does the security guard in your building think? What does the tricycle driver think? Taxi drivers, I have to say, great source of information. If you want to take the pulse, take the temperature of a city, of a country, talk to the taxi drivers. They're always generally pretty willing to talk, and they're very good at giving you a sense of what people are thinking. And I would just say as well, don't be afraid of asking questions. There's no such thing as a stupid question. I think a lot of young journalists will feel a bit shy, particularly at press conferences or when they're talking to someone, an expert. They don't want to seem silly. But, when I was starting out in business reporting, I used to always say to, stockbrokers and economists, I knew nothing. And I would just say, talk to me like you're talking to a 10-year-old. Explain it to me in simple language. If I can't understand it, how am I going to explain it to my readers? And I'll just end on saying, just emphasizing the importance of local journalism. Like, it's wonderful to have to be a foreign correspondent. It's very exciting, and it's a wonderful way of life, I guess. But local journalism, don't overlook it. It's so important about ensuring that local authorities are held accountable for their actions is essential to a functioning democracy, and it has a direct impact on people's lives. Anyway, I'll end here. I just want to wish you all the very best in your journalism adventure. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them.
Thank you. Thank you, Allison. And thank you for sharing your story. Very, very interesting. And I just wish I had met you when I was younger, and I could have used some of the tips that you had mentioned here. Let me bring in my co-moderator this morning, Arlo Custodio. Arlo, if you can please turn on your camera. Arlo is one of the editors who handles Campus Press. And for those who are attending here, if you guys have any questions, we won't be calling you to ask your questions directly, but you can use the Q&A feature on Zoom to pose your questions, and we will try to read as many as we can given the time constraint. But let me get things started, Allison. I was quite interested in what you said about how journalists avoid business reporting, finance reporting, but and you yourself, you've had your apprehensions. I was wondering if you can maybe talk a little bit more about that, because I know it's something that I tell even the young journalists I meet and some of those whom I've taught. And my personal approach has been to look at numbers the way someone would look at a foreign language. But I don't know how did you overcome that I suppose fear of numbers, right? And what are some practical things that you could share with those who are just starting out their careers? Because obviously I agree with what you say. In fact, if there's someone here who's comfortable with reporting about business and economics, I would offer them a job right now, because they're always in high demand. But maybe with some practical tips on how to get over that fear of numbers.
Yeah, it's a good. To be honest, I probably never got over my fear of numbers. Today, I'm still terrified of maths. But I think one of the so when I joined the business section of the Sydney Morning Herald, the editor there, because he was the one who sort of made me join the section, and he just said to me, because I was absolutely terrified, and I'm not kidding you, there were tears. I mean, I really wasn't very happy about going there. And he just said, look, business reporting, it's about people, and it's about ego, and it's about power. That's what drives these business decisions. And when you're talking about these businesses have lots of money, they don't need any more money. It's about power and ego. And if you sort of keep that in mind when you're talking to people, I guess, and when you're looking at these stories, I think it sort of helps break down the fear. I mean, these at the end of the day, these companies are they're not buildings, they're people, and it's people who are making decisions. So I guess to try and I guess that sort of helped me a little bit. But honestly, it's just it's about not being frightened to say you don't understand. Yeah. And that's what I had to do. I had to say to people, I'm really sorry. Can you explain that to me again? Because I really don't.
But that's a good approach, though, isn't it? I mean, if you understand it, then you can write about it, right? I mean,
there's no other way. There's no other way. Yeah. You just have to be humble and accept that. The thing about journalism is that we're not meant to be the experts.
Yeah.
We're meant to know who to ask. We ask the experts. So I think that's what's really key, is to always, remember, you're not expected to know everything. And I think as journalists, we just end up knowing a little bit about a lot of things. But, our job is to talk to the people who are experts, and be curious and not shy about admitting that you don't know, you don't understand something. Because if you don't understand it, if you're in a press conference, and I think I've had this happen to me many times, you're sitting there going, oh my God, I don't understand, but I'm so embarrassed to ask. I sound like such an idiot. And somebody else asks exactly the same question.
Same thing, yeah.
It wasn't just me, So I think that's really important to always remember that, and another thing I would just say is that, and I think this goes for every single profession, but particularly in journalism, we're often just winging it. We're thrown into situations where we absolutely have no idea what the topic is. We don't understand the topic. It's not our area of expertise. But suddenly you just have to become a sort of an expert, very quickly. When I went to Bolivia, for example, so when I was based in Brazil, I was deployed to Bolivia to cover. There was an election. There'd been some elections, and it resulted in lots of it was upheaval, street protests. I didn't know that much about Bolivia, but it's like, okay, you got to go. It's like, pack a bag, jump on the plane, arrive there, and you've got to start reporting as if you're an expert, as if you really understand what's going on. Yeah. And I think that's, as journalists, we just have to learn. You learn to roll with that, and just gather as much information as you can really, really quickly.
Thank you, Arlo. You want to read some of the questions that are in the Q&A inbox?
Yes, sir. All right. Hold on. But I have just one question for Allison. Is that all right?
Go ahead.
Yes. If there is a bit that you would encourage the young journalists to start from, what would it be?
Oh, a particular beat. Oh,
yes.
I think everything. I think try and dabble in as much as you can.
You've been around, sports, news, business.
Yeah, look, when I started, my first few years, those first two jobs, so when I started at the Sydney Morning Herald, I was what they call a trainee journalist. So we had 1 year as a trainee, and we were moved around to all the different sections. So I had to spend time on sport. I spent time as a court reporter. I spent time, I think, on the arts section, and then general news as well. And it really gave me a taste of all the different areas, and sort of helped me I guess, work out what I was really interested in and what I wasn't interested in. And I think that's because I think when you're starting out, you don't really know. And I mean, 25 years later, I'm still working it out. I'm interested in everything. So,
I started with weather, if you believe it. Right. Weather and obituaries. That was my first. That was my start.
Fantastic. I mean, obituaries are fascinating. I love an obituary.
Hello.
Right. There is a question, but it is from anonymous attendee, and the question goes like this: listening to your story was very fascinating, Ms. Jackson. You've been around so much, and you mentioned there were or are a lot of emotions that comes with it. With that, how do you keep or manage your emotions on a topic to create a more objective view on this story?
That's a great question. I have a couple of take that on in a couple of different ways. So there is like the emotion, I suppose, like, there are certain stories where you have very firmly held views, like that could be politics, or that could be views on sort of climate change, and you're talking to people who have very different views on those topics. And I mean, our job as journalists is to be objective, and you get your own little opinions and you put them aside and you listen to the person who you're talking to. And when you're writing the story, your job is to be balanced and fair and objective. So your own personal opinions need to be set aside. And that's not easy to do, and we're humans, but I think it's something you constantly work at. In terms of emotions of covering particularly stressful stories like natural disasters, or I guess my experience in Afghanistan, covering bombings with like mass casualty events. It's really difficult. I mean, we're not, we are human, and we and these sorts of events are very distressing, but at that time when you're reporting, you have to somehow, and I think this is something you just learn over time, is you learn to create some distance for yourself between what the topic that you're writing about and your own and yourself. And it's in that I guess that gap, with that distance, you're able to sort of protect yourself, because I think that's really important, is to try to protect yourself, not to lose all your emotion, but just try to have a bit of distance. And I can't even explain to you how you do that. It's just something I think you just learn with time, and then you get through that reporting, be calm, breathe, and then afterwards you can go away and have a little cry. And then you pick yourself up and you get on with it, and you face the next story. When I first started in Kabul, and I remember those first bombings that you could hear the bombing, and you would hear an explosion, and then once you realize where it was, and you think, oh my goodness, there's going to be a lot of people dead. And I remember my hands would start to shake. I guess the adrenaline would start running, and you sort of have to. I mean, there were times when the bombing was so close to our house that our house shook from the shockwaves, and in those moments we would rush down into the basement to our safe room, and then pop our heads out after a little while and go, okay, well, the attack's not too close to us, so the attack is not against us, so it's okay. We'll race back up into the office and start filing our story. And I mean, I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it, because it was just very in the beginning my hands would just be shaking and trying to type and be like, just try to calm down. And my job as the bureau chief was to be calm, because if I'm projecting stress and anxiety, then that feeds into the bureau. So my job was just to be calm, to talk calmly to people, and even though inside I was just like, oh my god, so it was hard though, and I guess that just comes with experience. I guess in terms of managing your emotions, it's something that you just learn with time and with experience. It's not easy. There's no manual for that.
Yeah, you're probably not easily surprised these days. Allison, there are just a couple more questions. One here from Jonathan Ace Robles from Emilio Aguinaldo College in Cavite. It's a senior high school. His question is, what do you think is the major role of journalists or news platforms in these times of disinformation and misinformation, knowing that social media is the main source of information for Filipinos, probably others as well?
Yeah, it's an existential question.
You mentioned that AFP also has a fact-checking service now. So I guess the role of the media now is, well, and it has always been, is just to present the facts and to present compelling stories that are well written, balanced, fair, factual. But obviously we're up against a torrent of misinformation, disinformation on social media, which is other platforms where a lot of people get their information. So how do we counter that? Very difficult. I mean, AFP has a fact-check service. There are many fact-check services now, or there are increasingly more fact-check services out there, particularly here in the Philippines. I think we're doing, there's a big effort to try to counter this sort of tidal wave of fake news, and to try to educate readers about
I guess, to make people aware of how prevalent fake news is, how to spot it, and just raise the awareness about it and just how dangerous it is. But it's difficult, and I don't think we're going to win that battle today, tomorrow, in the next couple. I mean, it's an ongoing battle, and education is a huge part of countering, of taking on fake news. Is educating people that how sophisticated this fake news is, and to try to teach people how to, I guess, not be accepting of just because they're reading something online that it doesn't mean it's true. And I guess try to steer them into credible media where that is run by professional journalists.
Interesting. Arlo, you want? I think we have maybe time for one more question from the chat box. Do you see anything there you want to ask? Go ahead.
From Jana Pineda, she didn't mention where she's from, but the question is, what do you think is the most important role of journalists in the peace process, especially in the context of the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine?
Allison, maybe if I can add something to that as well. Everyone's focused on Ukraine. People forget about Myanmar now, and it's been a year since the civil war there started. Aung San Suu Kyi is in detention still, and apparently from the anniversary report, I mean, there's been some resurgence in the killings or murders of the Rohingya. So maybe we talk about that, Ukraine, role of journalists in the peace process, but maybe touch on also how do we pay more attention to other conflicts elsewhere, especially this one closer to home.
Sure. I think in terms of reporting on the Ukraine, I mean, I guess our job is to bear witness, right? So to have actual people on the ground, reporting on what they can see with their own eyes, and from direct sources. And so I guess that's what we're doing. I mean, that's what a lot of media are doing. Where they're on the ground taking huge risks. It's a really dangerous situation to be in. But I think that it's just so important to actually physically be there, not try to report on something like that, because it's just, you can't, you have to have actual people on the ground. In terms of then that is taking up a lot of attention, rightly so, frankly, is on the Ukraine right now. I mean, this is it's a massive, historically, it's a huge event, and the consequences could be really devastating for a lot more, not just for the Ukrainians, but for it's going to have a ripple. It obviously is having a ripple effect around the world. I think news is just like that. It's just there are periods right now the attention is on the Ukraine, but on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But in a few months' time, hopefully sooner than that, but the attention will shift. It's not that these other crises, these other disasters, these other issues have been forgotten. AFP, for example, we have bureaus in all those places. In Myanmar, we have a bureau. We're still reporting on that country. We're still in Afghanistan. We're still doing the reporting. We're still trying to get the news out there. And I guess it's a matter of, as readers and as viewers, you have to sometimes you have to look a little bit harder for you. It's not going to be served up to you, on a platter. You have to, but the news is out there. It's not that these other places have been forgotten at all. They're still valued, but it's just at times there is just more attention. So some stories, like the Russian invasion of Ukraine, just warrant a lot more attention.
Has more impact.
And it's not going to be forever, but for now, that is the focus.
Yeah. All right, Arlo.
Yes, sir. Can we ask one more question?
Yeah. Okay. Maybe just one more. So. Allison has to get back from the campaign trail, or we won't get a news feed from. we may not get her news feed in time for deadline today. Go ahead.
From John Arzel Isip from Universidad de Manila, the question is: should journalism embrace the basic contrast between confrontational Western and the developmental Asian news writing perspective based on this contradictory cultural backdrops?
I think Allison, they're talking about the style, right? And the style of reporting.
Western and Asian.
Somehow, the Western cultures, from a perspective, seems more in your face, more confrontational, whereas Asians don't like confrontation, so they tend to be more deferral, and to authority when they ask questions. Is there maybe a good side, bad side preference, or?
Yeah, I don't feel like I'm an expert to sort of talk about that, but I guess I would just say that I guess maybe in the West we're a bit more direct and a bit more confrontational perhaps, and there's more deference for authority in some Asian countries. I guess if at the end of the day, as long as you get as long as you're asking the tough questions, however you go about it, then that's the most important thing, right? And as long as you're reporting the news just holding on to those basic journalistic ethics, as long as you're presenting the news in that way, then I guess whether you're asking your questions in a very direct way or in a more differentiated way, as long as you're doing that, then I guess it doesn't really matter. I mean, I'm not really sure. This is really outside my area of expertise. Sorry.
Well, maybe
I would just say, like, I think as journalists we should always be polite. I think especially when I think it's okay. There are times when you have to ask. You definitely have to be asking the tough questions, but you don't have to be rude about it. You don't have to be unnecessarily aggressive. I think particularly when it comes to people in authority and who are more experienced with dealing with the media, I think you have perhaps more leeway to be a bit more direct, a bit more, hard hit. I think when you're dealing with just regular people, it's such a privilege to be able to talk to people and ask them questions. And I'm constantly amazed that people want to agree to talk to me, because I'm like, they're taking time out of their day. They're making, they're giving up their own time to talk to you and to talk to a complete stranger and to trust you with their story. And they're trusting you to be faithful to what they're saying and to present their side of whatever the issue is. And I'm always just so stunned that people will actually put that trust in me. And it's a huge, real obligation then to sort of, make sure that you are faithful to that. And I would just say, when you're dealing with regular people, it's really important to always keep that in mind. This person doesn't have to talk to you. They're doing you a massive favor by just actually agreeing to comment on anything. And I think, we always have to be respectful of that and be kind. Kindness, I think, and being polite.
Yeah. Just be professional. Yeah.
Be professional, but yeah. That's what I would say.
Yeah. Maybe just some parting words from you, Allison. I think maybe if you want to address maybe the interest of the audience today. Of course, some of them, as you said, are in high school. Some of them are in college. But maybe if they want to work later on for AFP, what do they have to do now so that they may earn a spot in your bureau?
I guess. Well, journalism is hard work, and it's hard work to get into journalism. So it's, and I think if you want to get a job in journalism, you've got to be persistent. It's not easy. It's not an easy field to crack into, to break into. So I think, just to be persistent, don't give up. If I had given up at the first time somebody told me no, I wouldn't be here. So for my first job, I kept the editor of this. I worked for it was a newspaper that belonged to a group of newspapers, so there was like the big boss, and I just rang him every week. And
that's not Gary Packer, is it? Or
no, but it was Fairfax.
Quite an interesting character.
Gary Packer. I used to ring him every week and just say, look, I just want to meet you. That's all. I'm not asking. I just want you to know who I am. Like, I'm here and I'm keen, and And I just rang, and it went on for months, and I almost gave up. And then one day he just said, sure, yep, come in on Friday. And I went in, and it was a job interview, and I didn't even know it was going to be a job interview. And that was my first. He said, what do you know about sport? And I was like, oh, I love sport. My passion. And he's like, right, so how do you feel about being the sports editor of this local paper? And I was 19. So so I think persistence. I would also say, for me personally, languages have been a huge ticket to interesting jobs. So if you can learn another language, that's always really great. That's if you want to actually work abroad, I suppose. But if you want to stay in the Philippines, which is also really important because there's so much news here, then I think you just, I mean, go local. You know, start. Don't expect to start at the top. You know, be brief. You look at top. I mean, it actually makes it sound like there's some hierarchy. I think look at journalism as all journalism is important. So even if you're living in a province and there's a local paper, get some work experience on that paper. Just go and work for free. Hang out with a journalist. Just follow them around, see how they work, see how they operate, or ask lots of questions. Try to get stories published. Come up with ideas, work on a project, and ideas to these places, and then eventually, you know, you sort of work your way up. But if you just want to stay on a local paper, that's also really great because local journalism is really important, and it's probably the most vulnerable, you know, in the media landscape. You know, in terms of like these, you know, local publications trying to, you know, to stay viable. So. And the other thing I would just say is don't expect to make much money. If you're getting into journalism and you're thinking you're going to get rich, you're not. So this is one of the first things they told me at journalism school was if you think journalism is going to be your path to riches, you're in the wrong class. So, you know, it's not a career that's going to make you wealthy, but it certainly make your life a lot more interesting.
All right. Well, I think we have to leave it at that. There are many more questions in the Q&A box, but maybe we can just forward those to you, Allison, when maybe if you have time, you can reply to them. But we look forward to your reporting from Ilocos, and I expect to see that later in our inbox later. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope to see you in person soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Dante. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. It's a real honor. Thank you.
Arlo, would you care to introduce our next speaker?
Yes, sir. But before that, we just would like to acknowledge the presence of our attendees, and we have some from Thailand. So it is led by a Filipino teacher, si Carl Aguilar Garcia, and he has with him 25 students from Chaturat Witaya Karn School. Sawadee krap. And before we call on our next keynote speaker, we just would like to thank our presenters, co-presenters, sponsors, organization partners, and sponsors like SM Foundation, Talkshop, Video Unibank, Converge, Grab Philippines, the Manila Times TV, and our organization partners, Rears Chamber of Commerce Philippines, CCI France Philippines, Cebu Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Davao City Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Italian Chamber of Commerce in the Philippines, Financial Executives Institute of the Philippines, She Talks Peace, Management Association of the Philippines, and Philippine Center for Islam and Democracy. Now, if you haven't done so, we would like to invite you to follow the Manila Times on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, as well as YouTube and Dailymotion to get the freshest news all the time. Now, our next keynote speaker was former senior correspondent of Al Jazeera. She has traveled the world as a journalist for 3 decades with a career spanning 5 continents and 2 of the largest global news networks. After getting her start in the Philippines, she joined CNN in London, working across Europe and covering the war in Iraq from its inception. In 2006, she returned to Manila and the Asia-Pacific region, reporting from the front lines of armed conflict and climate change as senior correspondent for Al Jazeera. Her extensive coverage of the Muslim rebellion in the southern Philippines was recognized by the International Committee of the Red Cross for Humanitarian Reporting. A British Council Chevening scholar, she earned her Master in Arts in Literature and Criticism at the University of Greenwich. She speaks 3 languages and is the current editor of Migrant, an online platform which showcases writing from the diaspora, advocating a universal humanity beneath people's differences. She also has a novel, The House of Calle Sombra, published by Penguin Books. Friends, ladies and gentlemen, welcome our next keynote speaker, Ms. Marga Ortigas.
Thank you very much, Arlo. Thank you very much, Manila Times, for having me. And I think you're going to get an echoing of what Allison just said, because I was sitting here listening to her and just agreeing. And I'm sure Dante there will agree as well. A lot of what she said resonated. We seem to have started out around the same time as well, with very similar trajectories. I'm going to share my screen with you now, and I hope this works. We tested it earlier, and there we go. I'm going to try to marry here a little bit of a historical look at how media, news media in particular, has evolved in the time that I've at least seen it, participated in it, and taken it in, consumed it, as it were, and talk a little bit about what I learned along the way about the role of a journalist. I'm going to start at the very beginning here, the same way that many of you did as a campus journalist. I was 12 years old. I was in the 7th grade, which at the time was the last level of elementary. And we had a school paper, which was just for the grade school students. There was a separate publication that was for the high school students. And I somehow found myself at 12 assigned by the moderator to be the literary editor, which basically meant that I was supposed to handle the features and the less immediate or heavy news items in what was supposed to be a magazine read by 12 years old and below for the school at the time. Now, as you know, fun and childhoody, gamey that might sound, and it was, we loved it. You know, we were 12, we had a school paper. I was friends with everybody who worked in it, and we had a moderator who was just excited at the fact that she had students who were excited to be writing stories. It was a really good experience. See, but the thing is, it was also 1983. I'm dating myself, but it was a very iconic landmark year for the Philippines. So as I said, I was 12, I was in the 7th grade, and I found myself working in a campus school paper. Now, 1983, martial law had ended just a few years earlier, and it still shocks me, it boggles the mind that many people think that martial law did not exist, or that it was fake news, or indeed that it was not as terrible as it actually was. And I think that's a failure maybe of how we have taught the history of this country. But it was an awful time. I had classmates who lost parents who were called in to serve the people who were running the administration. And when they had outlived their service, they were pretty much disposed of. And by that, many of them had lost their lives. But at the same time, we also had people in the school whose parents were very close to the ruling family and participated, if you will, in that kind of governance. So it was a very mixed world. Now, it was in this atmosphere then that we had Ninoy Aquino, who, of course, I was 12, no idea, but you're hearing the name murmured in whispers. People were very afraid to kind of talk about it out loud, at least in the school. This was my experience. But it was a Sunday, we were at my grandmother's house, I will never forget this, and she had the television on. Lunch was being prepared, and for some reason the grown-ups were very curious to know what was going to happen with the arrival of this, to me, unknown Ninoy Aquino, right? And suddenly shots rang out, and I heard the grown-ups running to go to the TV to see what was happening. And it was the first time for me, at least, to have experienced, in a sense, an assassination live on national TV. We didn't see it. There was no camera pointed at the tarmac at the time. We heard it. There was a lot of freaking out and a lot of confusion as to what was going on. But clearly, as a 12-year-old, this made an impact. So when I got to school that following Monday, everybody was talking about it, but talking about it in whispers. Nobody really understood because our parents didn't want to really explain it to many of us. So we talked amongst ourselves to try to figure out what was happening. And suddenly we could see high school students wearing little pins, and then other students, you know, seemingly on the other side of the fence. And we couldn't understand. So as the grade school paper, we took it upon ourselves to come up with an issue to try to explain this to our peers as 12-year-olds so that they could understand what we also were trying to understand. Because we don't function in isolated bubbles. We live in a society that we are all trying to understand as best we can, because that's how we maneuver our way through the world. It's what living is all about. So we came up with this issue. Our moderator was really proud of us. We were proud of ourselves. We had poems, we had short stories. We had interviewed people who had roles in government. We thought we had something that 12-year-olds would be proud of. The problem was, come the day that we were supposed to see this finished product and distribute it to our classmates, there was no publication, there was no magazine. We weren't told what was going on, and our moderator just suddenly was no longer in the school. We couldn't find her, we couldn't reach her. Of course, this was the days before cell phones, there weren't even pagers. We didn't know where she was. So we got called to the principal's office, where we were then told that the printer had a problem and that they couldn't finish publishing our magazine, so we would just have to come up with another issue that they would bring out whenever it was ready. But we were completely aghast because we couldn't understand what was happening, right? Well, it turns out this was going to be my first experience with censorship, because the grown-ups at the school, of their own choice, I'm not saying that there was no government involvement in this, but they themselves were worried or afraid about this issue that they deemed too political for grade school students. And we found out later on, because one of our classmates had seen it, the magazines had arrived in school, they did not like what was in it, and they burned every single copy of a grade school magazine. Can you imagine? All of it burned. Our moderator was fired. And as poetic justice would have it, her name is actually, I will never forget it, in English was translated as good work. And she did a lot of good work. She inspired a lot of us, but then the school got rid of her. I don't know whatever happened to her, where she went on to teach. I understand she eventually left the country to teach elsewhere. But so as 12-year-old, this is what I'm learning as a young observer, which was ironically the name of our school paper. But it was a good introduction to the fact that information was powerful, or is powerful, but it can also be very, very frightening. So the nature of journalism is one of the first things that I picked up at 12. And it was this, that reality gives birth to stories, right? And there are many, many, many ways to craft a narrative. It doesn't make one right or wrong, but everybody has a perspective from which to view something and tell that story. And innately, that is all of us. We all have the power to craft a narrative, be it our own or something that we might be witnessing, right? But not everyone doesn't necessarily mean that they will want to hear what you have to say. Doesn't mean also that you then don't say anything at all. But another thing that I picked up at 12 was the roots of what would stay with me for the next 30 years, that there are certain constants to journalism, or constants to storytelling, which is what I like to call it. And if that photo there is some of the original journalists that I believe that might have been a very, very old 1960s photo of the ABS-CBN newsroom. I managed to work with a few number of those people in the photos, but at GMA 7. Anyway, but this is a summation really of what I would consider as the constants of journalism, constants of storytelling. There are people involved, there are lives involved. You have to respect those affected. Everybody that is participating in the story that you were telling, as well as the people you were telling the story to. And that's what I mean by the people affected. Respect everybody in that space. And then ultimately, underneath all of that, you have to exercise restraint. Don't put your own opinions in a piece. Don't try to sensationalize. Don't try to color it in any way. You are there to frame and represent a story that is presented to you, if you will. Now, again, as I mentioned earlier, the journalist is there, and I'm echoing also what Allison has said. You're there to witness, not participate. So what is bearing witness? You have to listen. You have to watch, not just what's in front of you, but what's around you, what's beside you, what's behind you, above you, beneath you. Just be curious and see everything around you. Pick up all the little things of the world that you are witnessing, right? Listen, talk to people, watch how they talk to each other. All of that goes into your understanding of what it is you are witnessing. That's how you digest the truth of the scenario that you are in. And then you have to present it fairly. And how do you do that? How do you present something fairly? By putting it in the proper frame. So you can't just take, let's say, the 5 facts of a story: who, what, when, where, why, right? And just say, well, here you go, this is it. Just present data. No, you have to put it in the proper context. What does that mean? Is this actually true? Like, where did this come from? All of that is the journalist's job. You have to put things into context. And if there's something, like with that school paper story, if there's something somebody doesn't want you to say, you've got to look into why, because even that is part of the story. Now, so that was in grade school. By the time I hit college, university, in the Philippines, in our junior year, we had this thing called practicum, where if you're majoring in a certain subject for a semester, you go off and work or get a trainee internship job in whatever company might be offering roles in the course that you're studying. And I was doing communication arts at the time. I wasn't actually studying journalism, but I managed to land a job at GMA Channel 7 right when the Gulf War had started. This is Gulf War I. CNN was just making a name for itself internationally. It had existed several years already in the US, but it was just coming to be known beyond US borders. And one of the things that really pushed CNN to the forefront here of international news was the Iraq War in 1991. So Channel 7 was paying to receive CNN, and they needed people, cheap labor, students, to come in and basically just watch what was going on 24/7. And this is what I did for GMA Channel 7. We sat there, we watched what was on CNN, and then we had to summarize it, write a little short news item about it, and we broke into regular programming for 5 minutes at the top of every hour to give everybody a summary of what was happening in that hour around the world. And that was the hourly news bulletins. It was very exciting for a 19-year-old, because like Allison, I too was 19 at this time, when you technically get your big break. But at the same time, it was also the beginning of realizing that this sense of needing something immediately or instantly was going to change the way TV news was going. For one thing, it made people feel more pressured to get things out there. So many times, instead of being able to fact check things properly, accidents could happen. Like, for example, when I was working at Channel 7 here, there was a it was the headline story at the time. A young girl in one of the very posh gated communities in Manila had been shot by the son of one of the justices of the Supreme Court, if I'm not mistaken. So everybody was watching this story. The girl was in a coma for quite a length of time. Everybody was waiting to see if she would come out of it, what would happen. And nobody had cell phones, like I said. So we had radios, little radio mics. And one of the reporters had radioed into the newsroom saying, basically asking, had she passed away? Because he had heard it on the street. But it was rumor. It wasn't true. It was choppy when it came into the news desk. The show had started, the primetime news bulletin. So the news desk editor only heard she has died. He didn't hear, has she died? He just heard she died. So he scribbled it on a Post-it, sent it to the anchor on the set, because they wanted to be first to break the news that this minor, she was a teenager at the time, had died. So they broke in to the news set. The lead anchor announced this story. Within seconds, we had the father of the girl ringing the office in absolute tears, beside himself, because he had just left her hospital room and he saw it on the news that his daughter had died, only to then panic, ring the hospital, and find out it wasn't true. So he called the network. I think they threatened to sue. I don't know if they did or what happened, but eventually the network fired a heck of a lot of people. That anchor also had to step down. And I remember, because I was on duty to do the hourly bulletins, I then had to go on after the primetime show and apologize for the error of the network, all because they were in a hurry to beat the competitors on a story that then later on turned out to not be true. So for me, this was a concerning development, but it also made me learn to be very, very careful about what I put out there and when I did it. I had to be very sure. but it was the beginning of what in the 24-hour news cycle industry you call feeding the beast. That you have to be first. It's an immediate media, it's TV. You could go live. You have to break into programming. You have to be seen on the scene of wherever it is that it's happening. So it was feeding the beast. That's what it was called. And hearsay very often can end up as fact. This sense of immediacy, it became, in a sense, institutionalized, particularly when the 24-hour news cycle began to really take hold. Because obviously CNN was the first, but then you had Fox, you have ITN, you had BBC. Even here locally in the Philippines, you had ANC, then you have the GMA 24 channel news network. Everybody was just trying to put news out there all the time, shoving all of this information in people's faces, barely having time to breathe, really. So in a sense, that immediacy, also it institutionalized the possibility for irresponsibility and insensitivity. Let me tell you a story here to do with this 24-hour news cycle, because from working with GMA Channel 7, I got a scholarship. This is how I ended up in London. I got a scholarship with the British Council, as you heard there earlier in the introduction, and I did literature and criticism, because at that point I had been working in news for 7 years, and I wanted something to round out my understanding of the craft of putting together a story, as opposed to just researching things or gathering facts. I wanted to learn more about perspectives, the human condition, how to digest human experiences, how to understand different cultures. And that's why I did literature and criticism. Now, from doing my master's in London with CNN, I got a job with CNN in London. And again, it was through persistence, very similar to what Allison said. I found out that CNN in London had a new bureau chief, and he happened to have been previously stationed in Asia. And when he was stationed in Asia, he came by GMA Channel 7 to give a talk one weekend, and I met him because I presented myself to him. I just said, hello, wanted to meet you, yada, yada, yada. So when I got to London and realized he had been moved to London, I kept calling him and sending him emails and basically saying, I met you in Manila 3 years ago, and then it was 4 years ago, but I just kept writing and kept writing and kept writing, looking for a job, looking for an internship, looking for anything. And anyway, eventually, call it what you will, persistence, kakulitan in Filipino, he gave me a break. I was able to get in. I started out punching buttons in the gallery, taking in feeds from agencies like AFP, Reuters, Associated Press. That's what I started doing. But it was a way to get in. And eventually, when the second Gulf War happened in 2003, I was working with CNN in London and I got sent to Baghdad. I'm going to tell you now a rather unfortunate story. I'm going to speed it up because I know we've got a time constraint here. We lost several colleagues at CNN in Baghdad. They were killed in an ambush. We were there at the time. We were quite a small group. We were all very tight-knit. And so they were very dear friends. And this is what I mean by needing to feed the beast. Because it was such a small community of journalists in Iraq at that time, we all knew each other. It was a very dangerous situation, so we all helped each other and we all had each other's backs. And like I said, we're there to witness, not participate. We are not actors in this story. Unfortunately, CNN at that time, management had changed. They were no longer journalists in the true sense of the vocation. They had become businessmen. They had become marketing men. They were there to compete with Fox News, who was slowly changing the face of what journalism was, particularly for TV. So when our colleagues were killed and we were still trying to figure out what had happened, obviously we still had to get word to the relatives of the people that were killed, one of whom had 2 very young children and a father who was in the middle of a quadruple bypass at this time. But our boss in Atlanta didn't want to wait. He wanted to break the news immediately so that he would beat the competition. Nobody was competing with CNN at this time. None of our colleagues from the other networks were going to announce this. In fact, they were all with us in the office, commiserating, sympathizing, and nobody was going to air with this because it's not the kind of thing that you go to air with because suddenly in a place where 200 Iraqis were dying a day, 2 journalists from CNN were killed, and so that's news. It caused quite the controversy in the office. We had a lot of our senior journalists basically pull their weight and buy us time and told the manager that none of them were going to be the ones to break the story on air until we all had a chance to speak to our families, to explain what happened, and to reach the people whose loved ones were killed, right? They didn't care what time of day it was. We were an international crew, and the bosses just said, fine, you have 20 minutes to call your families, and after that, we are going to air with this from Atlanta, since none of us in Baghdad wanted to do it. So I remember I had to call my mother. It was 3:00 in the morning in Manila at the time, something like that, to basically say, I'm alive, I can't explain, but if you see it on the news, it's not me. Can you imagine how strange a position that is? Not just for me, but to put my parents in. And the fact that we had a boss at the time who just didn't seem concerned, because they were more concerned with not being outscooped on a story that nobody was going to scoop him on. So, besides the whole immediacy of it, like that being first doesn't mean it's always right. But this was, again, the beginnings of how things were evolving for TV news. We were beginning to see it. It became more about personalities. It became more about performing in a way. This is when you began to see more talking heads on your international news channels. And what talking heads, I mean, the people who sit there as guests, who share their opinions. And it's just because they're on the network, suddenly you think the opinion is very important because here's this guy saying it on an international news channel. And then it became the start too of when you started to do stories on what they call the first person. So here's a person, he's talking about just his story. And if you don't put that into context, you lose out on half the story. And then the reporters needed to become more involved in what they were covering. So then that's when you have the reporter no longer become a journalist or a witness, but become a performer. For many networks, it became about what they called, and they still call it to this day, the optics, how things look. They'll send you somewhere. It doesn't matter if you understand or you have time to news gather. They just want you to stand there just so you have whatever it is in the background and say whatever it is they want you to say in the 5 minutes that they have you on air. Now, there's a lot of problems with that. As I mentioned, opinions are amplified and taken as fact when they're not. They're opinions. Context is often missing. And also that sense of impartiality that is needed if you're going to stand as a witness and have that almost distance, as Allison put it, is gone, completely gone. So again, feeding the beast. You remember this guy, right? Where hearsay can end up as fact. Well, with 24-hour news, that feeding the beast, suddenly it's a multi-headed beast. There's so many things you need to feed constantly, all sorts of social media. Now, by the time this was evolving, I had left CNN after Baghdad and joined Al Jazeera, which brought me back to Asia. And it was maybe halfway. I was with Al Jazeera for 11, going on 12 years. And it was maybe halfway through that they were beginning to tell us, Facebook, you've got to learn how to do Facebook Lives. You've got to learn how to do Instagram. And they were verifying our accounts. And all of this was because news again and storytelling was evolving. And the institutional media, where professional journalists were employed, were having to adapt to social media, which has democratized news gathering and journalism and information, which in one way, it's great, definitely, but it also allows for a lot of irresponsible data, if you can call it that, or fake news, as it's been called as well, to get out there. And there will be viewers and people who will not be able to discern what is to be believed and what is not, and what is fanciful creation, if you will. And all of this has changed also how we share the news or how we share information. It's become more voyeuristic. Many of you being students now have grown up in this atmosphere, and I can only imagine how difficult it must be to constantly feel like you're being watched. And even the way news has evolved, it's that sense of voyeurism. It's sensationalized to beyond something that I can't even recognize it anymore. And for me, doing this is a disservice, not just to the viewer, but to the story itself when you go overboard like this. Now, let me tell you a story. about Typhoon Haiyan. 2013, November, I was working with Al Jazeera. I was in Tacloban immediately after this happened. And a few days after we were there, all of the other international news channels who didn't have offices in Manila started to come in to Leyte. Many of them didn't actually roam the island, didn't actually go out and speak to people. They stayed in tents that were air conditioned, in areas that were cordoned off. But like I said, it was just so that they could be seen to be there, so that when they stood, they had images like this photo behind you, on the screen, behind them. So then they can say, look, I'm here, I'm live. And what would often happen is they would then spout things that were either sensationalized, exaggerated, out of context. Many, many times it was out of context. They didn't understand the nuances of the culture, of the people, how to digest the facts. So they would just say this on air. Then I would have my editors ringing me from Doha going, well, this network had this. Why didn't you say that? And I'm like, because it's not true. It's not true. So half the time that I was covering the first week of the aftermath of Haiyan, I found myself having to be a fact checker on air against everything else some of the other networks were saying, simply because they were reporting things as fact that were not, because they didn't bother to check, and because they needed to be sensational and they were voyeuristic in their coverage. It was like almost the more heartbreaking or tragic they could make something sound, the better it was for their ratings, for their viewership. And it was just appalling, because in a setting like this, you don't need to sensationalize. The pain is there. The stories are there if you talk to the people. But more often than not, they didn't put the people on air. It was just the anchor, who was from somewhere else and had never been to the country before and wasn't actually listening to what the locals were saying. Again, like I said, that's a disservice, right? Not just to the story, but to the viewers and to the job, is what I feel. So now we're in the age of social media, democratization of information, and that's great. Storytelling does evolve. But with all of that, I would say that institutions still matter. The trusted names, the ones who have been in journalism for decades and have professionals working for them. They're all now also trying to break into the social media platforms. You've got the BBC on TikTok, you've got CNN doing Instagram lives, you've got all of the most senior reporters being persuaded to participate in the social media dialogue, right? But what does this mean? It should also just mean that institutions need to do better. They need to do better. They have to set the bar higher, and they have to retain the responsibility for anything they put out there. So they shouldn't really feel compelled to participate in the sensationalistic, voyeuristic aspect that the wave now seems to be bringing everybody on. So like I said, the manner in which we might craft the narrative might change, but ultimately, we are all here just telling the human story. It's all part of the one narrative, all of it. And ultimately, the role of the journalist, we're not here to gather likes or get clicks for whatever bait headline we might put above our feature articles, right? But we're here almost to serve as a bridge between cultures, between people. And that's what we should never remember. And nothing, no amount of development in terms of digital technology will change that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Marga. Very, very interesting. So for those who want to ask questions, please use the Q&A feature. But before we go to the questions from Marga, let me just show the latest book I've read. Enjoyed it very much, Marga.
Thank you.
Perhaps maybe you can tell us about Calle Sombra. And I bought mine in the Fully bookstore in Labang.
Thank you.
Glad that they have it, but maybe you can talk about this work first. And
yeah, that's the thing. Everybody could say, how could you go from facts to fiction, right?
Yeah, I didn't realize you were initially interested in I was going to ask that, but I didn't realize when you just made your presentation now that you were really interested in literature early on.
Yes, it was always, I don't know if it had anything to do, probably not. My mother was a literature teacher. She taught high school. She taught high school. And it was just, I grew up in a house full of books. It was always about books. We were being forced to read from as early as we could read. I hated it. Didn't like it. Found it absolutely boring. You know, I hated it. There were no pictures. It wasn't colorful. It just didn't connect at all for me. Until I realized, maybe like at that, around 9 or 10, I started to write my own stories. I figured I was bored reading Nancy Drew. I'll write my own Nancy Drew. I called her Susan Baker. Diba? Kasi to me, it sounded so Western. It's like, I didn't know. Susan Baker. It was the very, you know, you can imagine a childish mystery novel, but I loved it. I loved the exercise of crafting stories. You get stuck in traffic. I would sit there, look at the car next door and make up stories about those people. Are they fighting kaya? What's happening there? You know what I mean? Keep me entertained. Because I was the eldest child. It was several years before I had my younger sibling. So it's just you. What are you going to do? Right? Talk to yourself, fortunately, you know, create your own stories. And then, so news, in a sense, for me, what I appreciated most about it, and I think that's why I wasn't one of those who, like, every time they'd send me for breaking news, I took the time. I always took the time to digest the story.
Interesting.
So that I wouldn't just stand there going, oh, there are 25 people hurt and whatever. I wanted to understand, what was this culture? What exactly happened here? Who was affected? You know, so even in the presentation of the breaking news story, there was always an element of the humanity behind it. So, and I think a lot of that is because I appreciated the craft of storytelling and not just who, what, when, where, why. Bilis, andyan na. You know, put it out there. So that, and I always attack news stories that way. And after, what year did I kind of left it in 2016, greatly because I was tired. I was working, you can imagine with 24-hour news, you're working around the clock. And I was going everywhere. I was sent left, right, center. I was, you know, based in Manila because it was an easy hub to travel from. So I was always crisscrossing the Asia Pacific region. Wow. And then I was being sent to Brazil. I was being sent to China. I was even sent to California at one stage. And then I was in the Middle East. It was just too much after a while, and I needed a break. Because my back, I was in several car accidents to do with work. And it was, my back was acting. You know, you began to feel I was paying the price for not sleeping and not knowing where you are and just constantly on the move, right? And I just took a break and I thought, I'll give myself 6 months. I'll write that book I always wanted to write. You know, the 6 months turned into a year, turned into 2 years, and then the book's not yet finished. I'll take another year, you know. And 5 years later, here we are. Finally, the book is out. But I think a lot of the things that I saw, the book is not factual, but a lot of the things that I saw or that I could pick up in the personalities that I met in my travels, this one particularly set in the Philippines. So from north to south, I was able to distill, hopefully, and find a way to reflect in the book. So it's not factual, but I was trying to also capture a nature, a personality of the culture, you know, more than anything else, which, in a sense, it's not quite journalism, but you can't necessarily say that it's just some fanciful storytelling that will not resonate.
Right.
So, but other than just culturally looking at the Philippines, I hope it resonates with people because it looks at family, which I've done certain book clubs lately and with international readers, which surprised me. And that apparently is what resonated with them the most, that sense of, oh, you know, my family's like this too. And I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry, you know, but
really, I don't want to give away the story of the book.
Exactly. No spoilers. Spoilers.
But you know, for those who are wondering whether, you know, what Marga's last name, Ortigas, you of course come from the Ortigas, the very well-known Ortigas clan. Was it?
It's not a family story.
No, I'm going to ask that. But what was it? How difficult was it for your family to allow you to go into journalism? Because, you know, you have this you have your family, and being a woman, I can only imagine your dad being very protective of you, and that's probably the rest of the family. But and people talk about how dangerous journalism is, and you've been to very dangerous places, right?
How
did they let you go and then do what you wanted?
My parents had no choice, unfortunately. When I got the job at Channel 7, I didn't ask them. I mean, I was 19, so technically you're not an adult. You're not supposed to go off and do these things, right? I did, because the school I was studying in was not too far from the network. So I literally went on my lunch break. Wait, there's an opening and like that. Let's go and test the waters. I went with school friends, and we just went to Channel 7, which was 10-15 minutes away from the campus, not thinking anything, on a whim. You're 19, right? Like,
I can almost hear your dad calling the network, "Oi," with a few expletives.
So we went, I didn't think we'd get it. So I didn't say anything about it. The next day we get a call, "You've got the job, come in, yada, 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 on Monday."
No.
So I was like, uh-oh. What am I going to tell my mom now, right? Because it was after school. The work was after school, which meant that after school, I was not going home. How am I going to tell my mom where I am, right? There's only so much, especially since it's not like you can be creative with your excuse because you're going to be on TV.
Right.
So it's like, you can't necessarily be untruthful. So I remember I had to say, I got this part-time job. It's, I'm studying communications in university. I might as well get some practical experience. She was not happy, and she was not happy. At that point, it was just, I'm just going to be sitting in the newsroom watching CNN and then regurgitating it. That's all. Oh, great. Okay, they can handle that, right? Because you're just, and then Pinatubo erupted. Mount Pinatubo erupted in 1991, which is still the most catastrophic volcanic eruption in recent memory, right? And Channel 7 decides, because I'm going to be learning from all of their senior reporters, you go with Jessica Soho to Mount Pinatubo. Okay. Right?
Shadow her.
So I went, because again, like I said, I was at work. You're not gonna think, who will say, let me call my mother first, right?
Yeah.
So I went. We did, which now on hindsight, we later admitted was really rather irresponsible, but the military took us up on a chopper and then flew us very close into the crater.
Oh my.
Right? As you do, because it's like everybody's trying to look what I can show you. Look, I can show you this. We're going to give you this great shot of a volcano actually erupting. So we got this shot, right? And then we landed, drove back to GMA, which was like 3 hours away from where Pinatubo was and where we did this chopper flight. And then we had the newscast. And so there I was, and yada, yada, yada. And earlier today, I got to do this. The minute it went on air, I had the director in my ear. Telephone your mother. And so, you're like, you're on air, right? It's live. And I'm just smiling there. And I'm like, I can't take the call. What? And so I could hear sabihin, I'll tell her to call back after the show. Yeah, okay. So the minute the show ended, again, the director, your mother on the call in the newsroom. So I go running to the newsroom, and first thing she says, "How could you do that without permission? You did not even ask." She's gonna hate me telling her, "You didn't even ask me permission." Because of course she was scared. And of course it never crossed my mind.
Right.
It never crossed my mind that I would be freaking out my relatives or freaking out as any of us would in that position. So yeah, it didn't. You'd think I'd learn from that, but no, because when CNN sent me to Baghdad, it was again one of those things where it was late on a Friday afternoon. They needed somebody like immediately. It was literally, you need to be on a flight in 3 hours, go home, get your bags, and go to the airport. You don't have time to think. So I called my family from Jordan to say, by the way, I'm in Jordan. I'm about to board a convoy, and then I'm going to Baghdad. Bye! You know what I mean? And I only realized it later on because my aunts and my cousins all said, "You know what you put your parents through?" But to their credit, they never, after that, they never really said anything because they could see it was, for me, it was almost a mission to do this job, to fulfill this role, and to be seeing all these places that I had only ever imagined or seen on TV. You know what it was like for me to have started out my career sitting there watching CNN cover the first Gulf War, and then by the second Gulf War, I was there with the people I had been watching. I still can't believe it. You know, it was like persistence does pay off, and also trusting the flow of where things will go, I think. You know, as you, I'm sure all know with journalism, you have to have a certain framework also when you go into a story or when you go into a breaking news situation. You kind of know what you're looking for or what to watch out for. But at the same time, because things are constantly evolving, you have to be the kind of person who can go with the flow, who can adapt, who can look around and go, "Hey, what's this?" Or, "Oh, this happened. Oh, sige, I will change my tack. I will go here instead." You have to be adaptable as well. And I think it's really, I just think the role of a journalist is just a more focused way of looking at any of us who are living our lives in a fulfilling way, I think, you know, because we're all telling stories to ourselves constantly to make sense of the madness of the world.
Well, I remember talking to your dad when he was still alive, and he was very proud of you. But I was just wondering if he was as chill.
He was, you know, I'll tell you this, and it's ironic because to my parents' credit, I was, you know, I know, and I get it. I get asked sometimes, "Oh, but your surname," and I was not raised like that. I had no expectations of what others might perceive of the surname or my family or anything of the sort. We were raised not even, you know, in the Manila community. My dad was working away and all of this. So I remember when I first started out in local TV in the Philippines, it was difficult in a sense because there were people who expected that I got the job because it was handed to me in some way, which I found I did not expect it. So you know how like you're new, you're young, you start zero. In a sense, I sometimes felt like I started at negative because I had to prove that I could even be at zero, like that I deserved to be there. So I think it makes you work harder to deserve the opportunity to be given this avenue into such an interesting role.
Well, was that ever a concern? Because, you know, the job itself is dangerous enough.
Yes.
Then you have this added layer of being an Ortigas. And I remember you were doing some reporting a few years ago. I think you were either interviewing MNLF or BIFF. I mean, was there, you know, concerns that, you know, did you ever hear people say, "Hey, look, you might get kidnapped, you know, because of your family and things like that"? And how did you deal with that? I was concerned, and again, to my parents' credit, they advised, but they never instructed or ordered. And ultimately it was, well, you're the one doing that. You're the one who's exposed to those communities or to those areas. And if that's your assessment, because you've been there before or you understand it better than we do, they trusted the judgment that I kind of presented to them. So if I said, "Look, when I feel something is unsafe, I'm not going to go there. But for as long as I feel still effective in the role, then I will keep forging ahead." You know, and like I said, to my father's credit, he never questioned, he never made bawal, he never said, "Don't do that," or "Oh my gosh, you're going too far." Nothing of the sort. And it was really just the one time. I mean, we never even really discussed it. Like I went off, I did the story, it got on air, and it's not like I came home and they were like, "Oh, what was it really like?" There was none of that. It's like, "Oh, hello, you're back," you know. And no,
at that time,
I can imagine the kanchaw. I can imagine the kanchaw from the newsroom. "Oh, if an Ortigas can cover it, why can't you?"
I never thought of that. But I remember one of the more difficult ones. One of the first story that we did for Al Jazeera was I cannot remember the name of the bagyo at the time. It was December 2006. Al Jazeera had just gone on air, and there was a huge, again, another one of those super typhoons. This time it hit Albay. Legazpi was completely destroyed, but it just so happened to also be when Mount Mayon had erupted. Remember?
Okay.
So there was lahar and ash flow, and that all came down the slope and buried communities, just communities. I had been in Iraq, but I'd never seen anything like that, where it was just, not to be graphic, but there was just so much death everywhere that the smell was overwhelming. The sight was overwhelming because you have sulfur on top of that from the volcano. You know, you couldn't drink anything. There was nothing. There was no power. There was nothing. And I remember the first, because we drove overnight from Manila to Albay. So that was like a 12, 15-hour trip overnight. And then we had to immediately start reporting. So you haven't slept, you're just straight on. And by the end of that afternoon, because I was having to do live shots, and my cameraman and our driver who was with us were all wearing masks because the smell was overwhelming. But I wasn't doing that for the live. And I remember right after the live, you're so overwhelmed with the smell of everything that's around you. And like as Allison said, you do everything at such a distance in a way because you're working. You're working. And so your duty is, I've got to gather the facts. You're talking to Aling Nena. You want to get her story because you're there to get her story. You're not there to feel the pain. How dare you? You know, it's her pain. This happened to her, not you, you know? So, but it's my role to present that. Like, all these people have lost all of this, you know? And after all of that, I called my father because I just didn't know what to do. And I remember I turned around in the car and they had all gone to shoot. And I said, just give me 5 minutes. And I called my dad. And he said, oh, how's it going? I just saw the live. And I just cried. I think for 5 minutes. I couldn't even speak. And then after that, I said, I don't know. And he said, it's okay. It's okay. And I said, okay, I got to go now. And then I put the phone down because I had to go back to work. And that was it. And that was enough. And I remember my dad, he didn't ask me about it afterwards. It was just, what are you comfortable talking about? Okay. And if you're not, and I remember after I spoke to my mom later on and she said, what did you say to him? You know what I mean? Because he just looked shell-shocked now. And then he just said nothing. And he just kept saying, it's okay, it's okay. And then when my mother asked him, what happened? He just said, oh, nothing, she's fine. You know? Wow. So I think we put these things there to help us cope. Right. And deal with very difficult situations that you kind of, in a way, have to bear. Right. You know, to be able to tell the story. So fascinating. Arlo, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hog all the questions here. I think there are a few. You want to get to some of those questions, Arlo?
Yes, but before that, Marga, we hope that your book is going to be a bestseller.
It already is, I think.
Hey, thank you, Arlo.
Buy your own copy. Don't borrow mine.
Okay, we'll have you sign it. All right. There is one from St. Paul College of Parañaque who is also a grade 7 pupil, like you were when you were.
Yes.
So with all her comments, her question is, what voice can you give to aspiring journalists to get back the sense of urgency and curiosity? And what do you think can make reporters explore the unfamiliar?
You know, for me, and this might seem weird, but I put down your gadgets. Put down your gadgets. Don't look at your screens. Don't look at your phones. Give yourselves several hours in the day of just being present where you are. You know, even if it's at dinner, sit down, talk to your family, talk to your relatives. Pay attention. If you're in the car, why do you need to be on the phone? You know, or if you're on public transport, look around, eavesdrop, you know what I mean? Not for the sake of making chismes, but to just pay attention to how people move, what they're like, how they talk to each other. Just all of this, if you put down your gadget, will be of interest because you will see it very differently when you're not seeing it through a screen. You know, that's my first, and I think my main tip for people nowadays and for the younger generation, because being glued to your gadget changes the way you look at reality. And in a sense, it detaches you from it, not in a healthy way, I feel.
Okay, there's another one. We have several, so we can just send them out to you.
Sure.
But this one is from Vince Jasper Hibe of Universidad de Manila. So it's like a summary now. So despite everything that had happened, what is your message to all the aspiring journalists someday?
Like Allison said, be persistent. be curious. And my thing is always be open. You do not know everything. And it's knowing that you do not know everything that will make you more effective in the role. Because if you realize you don't know everything, you will want to go out there and learn. You want to ask people. You want to know. You want to see how things work. You want to know why things don't work. Why do people feel the way they do? If it was always very interesting when people go, what is your opinion? And I found that more often than not, I didn't particularly have one that I even wanted to share, because you're there to learn all of it, right? And it was learning all of it, even if it's a little at a time, that made everything so much more interesting. Because you can't the world is not black and white. It is not black and white. And it's learning to see the nuances and the shadows and the shades and the textures. That's where journalism comes in,
Thank you so much. Can we ask some more?
Yes.
I think we have time for a couple of more. Two more.
Yes. Since you are now more of a literary personality, is that correct?
No naman. I'm still a writer. I wrote a book instead of a news story.
Okay. This is from Jimmy Pilar Riha. No, it's cool, but the question is, how do you see the responsibility of the literary critic today? Should they champion new authors and new books, or should they act more as curators, telling their readers what is worthwhile?
I think that's almost the same thing, I think, because if you are a curator, you're in a sense already championing the work that you're putting forward, as it were, right? Or that you're curating. But there is one thing I have learned, there is room for all sorts of voices. So just because I might not like a certain book doesn't mean it's not a good book. The storytelling might not be to my taste, maybe, but if it still effectively gets across its point, then it worked, right? So there's no right or wrong way to do these things. There's just different ways to do it effectively, I think. And how is it effective? If you transmit something that moves someone. So that's another thing that is very important for journalists to have, is empathy. Because I don't espouse, like, you know how the beats now, people are like war correspondents, and then they pose in their flak jackets, and I'm a war correspondent and I'm big time. No way. And I feel like if somebody is just constantly covering war, you lose a sense of humanity that makes you an effective journalist. You need to still constantly remember that it's not about the bang bang. And you're not also there to just cover the bleeding hearts. It's all of it put together. And I know that after, there were people who just kept constantly pushing themselves as war correspondents, but networks, I think more and more now, are rotating those roles so that people aren't in areas of conflict for very long, because it does take a toll on the people that are in those spaces, and it changes them. So the way they tell the stories also changes, and that's not an effective war correspondent if you get so completely embroiled in the conflict.
Marga, what are some of the books that you enjoyed reading, or maybe that you think are important for young people to read now? What made an impact on you when you were in high school and college that you like to recommend to these guys now?
I really like Nick Joaquin.
Okay.
I really like Nick Joaquin. I think, and the thing is with him, the thing that first made an impact on me was his story Mayday Eve. There was just almost something incredibly magical, but so painfully real. It was such a simple story, but I don't know why, it just resonated with me. And I was 15 at the time. And it's still, when I reread Mayday Eve, because I reread it a lot, it was just magic, that story. So Nick Joaquin. There's a book called The Story of an African Farm. Olive Schreiner. That's another one. Pick that up if you can. And it's one that here, at least in this part of the world, it was one of the books that I studied when I did my master's, but it made such an impact on me. I can't even begin to describe why. I don't know. I can't describe it. It's set in South Africa. But that one really was something else. And then I like people who use language very sparingly, whose sentences are short. Italo Calvino, who's an Italian author. if on a winter's night a traveler. So I like stories like that where they play with words, and because of the way they juxtapose the words, the sentence meaning will change simply because of the way they put the words together. You know.
How about Gabriel Marquez
Garcia Marquez?
No poses, no commas, no periods.
It's a bit too long, some portions for me. You know what I mean? I've read a few. I've been able to digest some of the shorter texts from him, and I know I sound a bit like a heathen by saying that, you know, the 100 Years of Solitude for me felt a bit like 100 years. No disrespect, of course, but it was, yeah. Like I said, there's a book for everyone, right? So
Yeah. Arlo, maybe one more question from Nana. Is there another one that you find interesting?
Yes, let's go over it.
We won't have time to ask all of them, Marga, but maybe we can
no worries.
send them to you
Sure.
later. Yeah.
All right, this one is from Angelica Mejia, a second-year college communication student. And we can go back to Al Jazeera because that's her question. Where do you see Al Jazeera's paradoxical free press editorial policy versus its state-subsidized administrative operations involving now?
Interesting question. Do you know what's funny? And this is why it's institutions matter, but we really should hold. When I say institutions, I mean journalistic institutions. So like the CNNs, the Al Jazeeras, the Fox Newses, all of this. Even the Manila Times, if you will, or here you have, you know, the Inquirer, the Philippine Star. Of course, they matter. They hold themselves to a higher level. But with the democratization of information technology and media, the public should hold institutions to a higher level so that they even push themselves further, you know, move the bar higher, as it were, keep raising the level of journalism that the institutions do, so that even the fake news will fall by the wayside in comparison, you know? So in terms of Al Jazeera, for example, yes, it was state operated. And in the beginning, when I moved from CNN to Al Jazeera, that was one of the questions that crossed my mind. But we were set up, a lot of the bosses were English, Canadian, American, and had worked with the bigger international news networks. So it surprised me in a sense that it wasn't what many had expected at the time. Oh, you're going to be a mouthpiece for the Middle East, you know, and we really weren't. Even any of the pieces that I did in Mindanao that had to do with the minority rebellion of Muslim fighters in Mindanao, they never got involved editorially in a sense of report this way or report that way. Not at all. In fact, I had more of that kind of directives working with a more Western news company, shall we say, because it was always, remember, you know, that might have happened there, but 3 US Marines were killed. There was always that. Balance it out. I'm like, how does 3 US Marines balance out 3,000 civilians? You know, but it was always because they were catering to a market, right? They had to do stories a certain way that would appeal to the market. And the one thing with Al Jazeera was it wasn't feeding a market. Yes, it was state-owned. Unfortunately, the state did not get involved with the stories. And I know Al Jazeera itself, because of the way it covered stories, has put the state of Qatar in very awkward positions, diplomatically speaking. So the whole thing is interesting because now you have state-backed TV networks everywhere. You've got China, you've got Russia, you've got France 24, you've got Italian TV, you've got Spanish news TV. So now everybody is determined to put their stories out there in English from their own backyards. You know, even Taiwan now is putting up a 24-hour news, is looking to put up a 24-hour news channel, as it were, or news company, reporting in English. Because they want to get their stories out there or put their stamp on international stories with their perspective, which is interesting. And again, there's just all the more stories out there for people to digest, I think. And with all of that, we have no more excuse to be ignorant, I think, you know?
Well, thank you very much. I think we have to leave it at that because of time. But before we go, please pick up your copy of this wonderful book. I guess I got mine from Fully Booked in Alabang. I don't know which other branches have it, but highly recommend it. I'll seek you out, Marga, so you can sign my copy. And Arlo, you're not allowed to borrow mine. You have to buy your own
Yes,
copy.
I have to buy my own
And
copy.
thank you all very much for giving me the chance to speak. I hope in some way I've been able to contribute to their
Absolutely, I feel like we don't
desire
have
to
enough-
go forth in this industry,
Yeah, I feel like we could talk on for hours, but we do have that schedule to mind today.
Yes.
But
Thank you.
let me just say to all of those who are watching this event today or at a later time, if you want your school newspaper to partner with the Manila Times, you may reach out to us at campuspress@manilatimes.net. I'll put that in a chat box. Once again, thank you, Marga. Allison had to go back to the campaign trail. Thank you to her as well. And thank you to all of the viewers joining us here today. And until next time, see you at the next Manila Times Business Forum. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Marga. But before we go, we would like to thank again our sponsors. And we have a surprise here, sir. Our team have come up with a digital raffle, and we are just going to announce now the winners. From Grab, it's a voucher worth 1,000 pesos each. And we have 10 here. Jonathan Ace Robles, Jacqueline Husciano, Marian Nang, Jana Pineda, Lino Longsad Jr. III, Koji Morales, Mariana Perena, Charles Justin Delphine, Abelard Garcia, who is in Thailand, Tyrell Gerard Malanay. So these are the 10 winners that we have for a Grab voucher of 1,000 pesos each. And again, we would like to thank our presenters, co-presenters, sponsors, organization partners, and sponsors. SM Foundation, Talk Shop, Video Unibank, Converge, Grab Philippines, the Manila Times TV, our media partner, as well as our organizational partners, Brisk Chamber of Commerce Philippines, CCI France Philippines, Cebu Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Davao City Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Italian Chamber of Commerce in the Philippines, Financial Executives Institute of the Philippines, She Talks Peace, Management Association of the Philippines, and Philippine Center for Islam and Democracy. Again, we also enjoin you to follow the Manila Times on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, as well as YouTube and Dailymotion to get the freshest news all the time. So that's all for today. Okay, we would like to present our certificate of appreciation to Miss Allison Jackson, the Bureau Chief of AFP Philippines, for being one of our speakers today, and also to Miss Marga Ortigas, former Senior Correspondent, Al Jazeera and the editor of Migrant, who is now an author. So please don't forget her book. You can find that out. So we would like to thank everyone. So we would like to announce also that this is so far the biggest digital gathering for campus journalists. We have around 500 attendees, and also the biggest gathering for the whole Manila Times. Again, thank you so much, guys. So if you have more questions, you can email us at campuspress@manilatimes.net. So yung announcement ni Sir Cling kanina, we enjoin our campus press publications to have a connection with us through Campus Press of the Manila Times. Thank you. Bye. Until next time.
for a year and pay less than 71 pesos per month. Visit tmt.ph/digital to get your free 30 days of the Manila Times Digital Edition.